when I was a teenager, a social justice warrior was out campaigning for the rights of others. They wanted things like equality. They wanted fairness. They wanted people treated with dignity. What we have today, what they're calling social justice today, seems more like social vengeance, social injustice, really. And the best way to create justice is to create more injustice somewhere else.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Darren Magee, who's a psychotherapist in the UK. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So, Darren, welcome.
Welcome. Well, I would say welcome, Ryan, as if you're on my channel. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for having me on today.
Yes, it's great to be talking to you. I enjoyed connecting with you, following you on social media. Tell me a little bit about your background, where you come from.
I come from Northern Ireland, and what you can tell from my accent. That's where I live. That's where I practice. My journey into therapy would have went some kind maybe in my 30s. It was a field that I was interested in, having been to therapy myself many times. I'd also seen a lot of things going on in my life, the people around me, things that were happening to them. By the time I'd reached 30, 3 guys I grew up with had committed suicide. I was seeing a lot of addiction and things. Now, I had worked kind of in the voluntary sector on a voluntary basis, working with people that have different kind of needs and so on. So it was kind of a natural progression to move into counselling and psychotherapy, even though I might have did it a little late in life. I was in my mid-30s.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 38 now and about to finish up my program, so I understand that course trajectory. Do you have a specialization, a specific thing that you focus on, or are you kind of just general psychotherapy? What?
I would tend to work generically. And sometimes it's funny how sometimes you will get a wave of people and it might be an addiction. There might be anxiety. There might be historical issues. So there is a wide mix of people that I would work with for different issues and so on. I just think it's funny. I don't know if I've never been able to figure out the pattern, but sometimes a batch of people will come in waves and they're presenting with similar things like, as I say, bereavement or addiction or relationship problems. So, but I would generally work generically.
Nice. So tell me, one of the things that I like to go over with people is what you were seeing in graduate school, because I feel like in the last few years, there's been a big shift away from focus on developing skills and techniques and understanding modalities and towards kind of multiculturalism, social justice, heavy emphasis on politics. You graduated 2009, is that correct?
Yeah.
So tell me what you were seeing in graduate school. Do you feel like it prepared you well to be a therapist?
Very interesting questions. Does it prepare you to be a therapist? When I first started training, when I first started studying, and would have been maybe about 2005, something like that. And it's an interesting field. What we found in the first year, whenever a lot of people joined because it is very interesting, learning about psychology, the way humans interact with each other and so on. So you might have had people, and if I was to be honest, maybe myself included at the time, thought there was something very romanticized about it. And then you would have had people who thought that this was going to give them some kind of status. And then you would have had people who, for them, it was maybe a natural progression in their careers and so on. But by the time we got to our final year, there was maybe out of a class of about 20, there was maybe 6 of us left. Because like a lot of things, especially if something is romanticized, the real and the ideal very rarely meet. They're very rarely the same thing. You would have had people as well, I don't want to sound unkind about them, but you would have had people as well that, again, they thought they were going to get some kind of status out of something, powerful about it. They're going to fix the world one person at a time, And again, in reality, the more you learn, the more you learn about the different approaches, the more you learn about yourself. Because I'm sure it's the same today. Part of your training is personal therapy. You have to go through your personal therapy, and the more you're learning about yourself, like everybody, I imagine there's some people that didn't really want to know certain things about themselves, things they didn't really want to talk about. But back then, in the mid-2000s, we were learning very much about people like Carl Rogers, Freud, Erikson, Ellis, people like that. It's hard to remember. It's hard to know if there were a political bias somewhere. Now, that being said, I did read somewhere that a lot of people that go into roles like therapy, professions like therapy, do tend to be left-leaning. Maybe there's something in that. I don't know. Um, but other than that, I can't remember at the time things being imposed on us, being taught to think and act in certain ways and address people in certain ways. We were more looking at people as individuals, distinct, unique individuals, with their own frame of reference, their own background. We're not there, if you think of Rogers, we're not there to judge. We're not there to turn someone into the best version we think they should be. So it seemed very different back then. What has come since? I'm sure a lot of people talk about the bias and so on that you were talking.
Is there a specific theory or modality that you tend to practice more or tends to resonate with you more?
Well, I would be an integrative therapist, which means I would draw on different elements, and sometimes it depends on the client. It depends on what they're bringing, but I would draw a lot on the person-centered approach in order to be able to build a therapeutic relationship. I think cognitive behavioral therapy is very useful, though I would tend to think of it more as a tool to use in therapy as opposed to a standalone therapy. Maybe that's just how I approach. Psychodynamic work, I think, can be very important, especially when we're looking at historical things, things that are very deeply ingrained. Looking at a person's, if you will, look at the disharmony that's going on internally with what's going on externally. It's that disharmony between the two. And so looking at what's going on with someone and how they relate and interact with the world around them. What I found in the past few years, which I've been finding very, very useful, is Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim's solution-focused approach.
Yeah.
That I find has been very, very helpful. Looking at not just exploring difficulties, issues, problems, deficits and things like that, but there's that paradigm shift where you're starting to look at exceptions. Because people will say it's always this, it's never that. It's very powerful to be able to start to look at exceptions and explore them. What was different in those times? Also looking at strengths, opportunities, resources, and building resilience and confidence. So I would draw on different things. I wouldn't really have a favorite as such, but sometimes I would lean more in one direction, if you know what I mean. But it really depends on what the client's bringing.
That's really, those are, I think you named 4 that I really like a lot. Person-centered, when I was learning about the theories, was my least favorite. It just seems really boring. And as soon as I started seeing clients, it became my favorite.
Yeah.
It's very useful, like in the moment, in the room with you, to kind of have that framework and that lens through seeing things. I love the depth you get out of psychodynamic.
Mm.
CBT, I love the tools of CBT. I feel like I'm fairly new to this, so I don't have the instincts yet to apply them well. I think you have to have good instincts to know when to use those interventions. And I really love the solution focus you were talking about. I feel like that cuts to the heart of, we spend so much time on the negative aspect of what's wrong with you, and just shifting that focus to, what are the exceptions to that? When did things not suck?
Yeah.
How can we look towards a better future? I feel like that's so valuable. So I love those 4 schools of thought that you pointed to. Where do you think that current psychotherapy today in the UK is missing the mark?
I think the best place to see it is on social media. You look at how, now I'm not saying that therapists shouldn't have opinions. Of course they do. Of course we all do. We all have opinions and so on. But it's sometimes how these things are presented. And it's curious, if you ever look at some of the stuff that they put up, I think it's curious that you get some therapists talking about how they hate the word resilience. Well, okay, well, what do you mean? Well, we'll just get rid of it then, or we'll be find a new word, And I'm wondering sometimes, do they even know what resilience is? Do they understand the meaning of it and why that might be important for a client? So there could be something in that. Even a couple of years ago, I remember scrolling through Twitter, X, and looking at some of the things some therapists were saying. These are UK-based ones. I would never see someone who votes for this party because of X, Y, and Z. And I'm looking at it and thinking, you're saying that you're a person-centered therapist in your little bio, and yet you're not accepting of people. You are being judgmental. The positive regard, they have to earn it from you. Really? So I think it's strange. Now, that being said, I think social media, as good as it is, we have instant communication, we have instant information, and so on. as good as it is, I think social media does have this tendency to maybe bring out the worst in people. And I think that therapists aren't immune to that, even though a lot of them might claim they are super self-aware and all the rest of it. I don't think they're aware of it.
Yeah, I've noticed that from what I've seen on therapist Facebook groups, the Reddit therapist threads. It seems very homogenous, always very left leaning, and very little tolerance for dissenting ideas.
Yeah.
I've heard a number of therapists say, like I wouldn't treat a Trump supporter, or like I wouldn't want that kind of person to come in my office. You see this, it's like people with certain politics are icky, but if you're really coming from a person-centered perspective, you'd want to help someone regardless, right?
Yeah, it's Rogers talked about those well, he talked about some, but the three core conditions. You have empathy, you have unconditional positive regard, you're congruent. You're being honest, you're being authentic. As I said, sometimes when you read it's not that people shouldn't have opinions, of course they do, but it's how they're presenting these things that, if this person here is clearly bad, they're not on my side, so. It's again, and I wonder if this is a social media thing or is it just the way the world is going? Everyone's getting pushed into camps, whether you want to be in a camp or not. You're getting pushed into a camp. You're either on my side or you're the enemy. And that's as I say, therapists aren't even immune to that.
Is there a time you started noticing this? Because I feel like, as you said earlier, I think the therapy profession has always been a bit left leaning, but it seems like in the last 5, 7 years, something like that, maybe 10 years, I don't know. It took a hard left turn to the point where it's like, we're not even willing to, the idea that you would be a conservative therapist seems just like horrific to them. Like, is there
Right.
a time you notice that start to shift?
Yeah, it would be like a good demon,
Yeah, yeah.
I can't remember when I first started noticing. I wouldn't really have done a lot on social media. I would have been involved, and maybe every other week I would have had a look. It was really only just like everyone else. It was during lockdown that I would have spent more time than I normally would have. Well, what else did we have to do? So I would have spent more time and I would have been seeing more and more. This is the thing, you mentioned about being left leaning, and yes, it does seem to attract people who lean towards the left. I think a lot of what we're looking at these days is not necessarily a left-right issue. It's not a left-right thing. I think what we're looking at is personality types. And what I mean by that is Andrew Doyle wrote a book, if you're familiar with Andrew Doyle, he wrote a book called The New Puritans.
Yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, it's a good book, very very good. But Andrew Doyle is if
He's
you ever
great.
see his comedy stuff, he is very very funny guy.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that is a good term. Now, he's talking about the social justice warriors and so on. I think the term applies to more personality type, a more personality construct than a political ideology, if you will. Jordan Peterson asks a question a lot. He always asks, when does the left go too far? And he always says he's never had a satisfactory answer. Now, I'm not claiming that I can give him a satisfactory answer. I think if you want to look at that question, the left goes too far when you can't tell any difference between them and the right.
Mm.
And that's what I mean. The Puritans. We are right. We are noble. We are justified. We have the right answer. And anything that isn't us is bad and so on.
It's really fascinating what you bring up there, because the left, at least in theory, is motivated by empathy, right? And I think it's that empathy that makes the therapy profession so vulnerable to being hijacked. Because kind of the one aspect of a therapist that's absolutely necessary is to be empathetic, right?
Mhm.
And so, if you look at like kind of this left-wing discourse, this social justice discourse, it's like, well, if you really cared about the poor, racial minorities, the marginalized, women, gay people, fill in the blank, if you really cared, you'd go along with our vision. And maybe the first step in that is, okay, don't tell inappropriate jokes, racial or misogynistic. Okay, well that makes a lot of sense. Let's do that.
Yeah.
And then somehow you miss a number of the steps down the road, and it's like, well, you have to support running all these medical experiments on children, and you have to support sexism against men, and more racism is the cure to racism. And you're like, I don't know how I got here, but I feel like I have to keep being more empathetic I have to keep going down this road, but it stopped making sense at some point. Is that
I get what you're saying, and I would agree. If you were to look at what happens on a societal level, and you were to compare that to maybe a coercive, abusive relationship, if you met someone for the first time, you were going on a date or something, and you went on a date, and they were to say to you, before we go any further, I despise every part of you, and I'm going to spend my life ruining you. I don't want you wearing a black shirt anymore. I like white shirts. So no more black shirts, and lose the beard. And do you have any family? Well, the last thing I want is for you to have contact with people that actually care about you, because they might notice something wrong. So cut contact with your family. And do you have any friends? Well, I haven't even met them, but I've decided they hate me. So if you want to be in a relationship with me, you're going to have to dump your friends. Now, if you went on a date with someone like that, I don't have to tell you there isn't going to be a second one. You already know this person's a lunatic. This person is out to destroy me. They've even told me. So what happens is little, small, subtle steps, little, small, tiny things. Things start to become problematized. You want to go and visit your family. You haven't seen them for a week or two, but then, all of a sudden they take a headache, they're ill or something. So you're going to have to stay home and look after them. You go to do something in your own best interest and they stop talking to you till you figure out what you've done wrong. Do you know what I mean? So a little piece at a time. Pardon me. That's the thing about living in my part of the world, is anytime you get sunshine, we get hay fever. So a little piece at a time, your sense of self is eroded. Your sense of right and wrong becomes eroded. Your ability to stand up for yourself becomes eroded. You're left feeling like you're the bad guy, you're the villain for saying no, regardless of what they're saying. So little things are problematized a little piece at a time. Little pieces of you are taken and rewritten, if you know what I mean. You're being reprogrammed a little piece at a time. And one day you realize you're in a relationship with a complete monster. How the hell are you going to get away from them? Because they maybe have access to all the money. They have their name on your property and everything. You know what I mean? So it's going to cost a lot to get away. And even then, if you were to try and leave, some of the research shows that the abuse tends to intensify when someone tries to leave an abusive relationship. So there can be fear that keeps someone stuck. So there's a lot of different things going on. When what you were talking about is on a societal level, if you were to look at these things through the filter of an abusive relationship, it's exactly the same thing. It's just happening on a bigger scale. That's why I said I don't think it's a left or right issue. It's a personality type.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering, I've written and talked a lot about cluster B personality disorders. I'm wondering if you see that. Does that resonate with you when you look at kind of what's going on in this field?
Yeah, well, you think of cluster B, you've got, first of all, antisocial personality, which you're really looking at things like sociopathy and psychopathy, and what you're looking at is callousness, disregard for the well-being of others, disregard for the rights of others, acting without remorse. There's histrionic. Do you know what? Spend 2 minutes on TikTok, you'll see it all over the place. Pay
And that's the
attention
whole
to
app.
me. Pay
Yeah,
attention to me. I'm so
that's all there
wonderful and
is.
special. People filming themselves crying because somebody gave them a latte instead of a cappuccino. It's all attention seeking. There's borderline. There is the fear of abandonment. There's the fear of being rejected, but there's also a lot of emotional dysregulation. And I think it's interesting. You might be familiar, I mentioned Ellis earlier. If you look at Ellis and his 12 irrational beliefs, one of those beliefs being everyone should like me, or everything should be easy. There's different beliefs within that, the 12 irrational ones. So you see those kind of things a lot as well, the emotional dysregulation. Then you have narcissism, which seems to be the buzzword of the moment. Said to you earlier, you ask someone out on a date and they say no, well, that's because they're a narcissist, you see. But the boss doesn't let you have next Tuesday off, well, they're clearly a narcissist. But with narcissism, you're looking at a sense of entitlement, a sense of, a false, deluded sense of superiority, and a need for domination and control. You see those four things together, yeah, you get to see it a lot. Once you know what you're looking for, I often say, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
You talked about kind of the nature of this. You've got this unstable personality, this emotional instability, and it's tough to exit that relationship because maybe the other person has control of your finances or something like that. I'm thinking of how to compare that to what's going on. I don't know what the situation is in the UK, but in America, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Counseling Association, all the major associations are pretty much controlled by social justice ideology. And if you just take one issue like child gender transitions, all of them would tell you the only appropriate way to treat gender confused minors is with gender affirming care. And so if you wanted to leave kind of this group of people, you're kind of on your own because this is kind of where the trust comes from. And the trust has a big financial incentive because here in America, if you were to leave one of these bodies, you can't bill insurance anymore. Right. So your income is kind of tied to that. So this really is like that type of abusive relationship on a large scale.
Yeah. Um, Even when you use the term social justice, again, I think what we see is, and this would be very common, it's part of the problematizing in the early stages. What you see is the rewriting of language in the sense that you think of a social justice warrior. When I was a teenager, a social justice warrior was out campaigning for the rights of others. They wanted things like equality. They wanted fairness. They wanted people treated with dignity. They didn't believe that yeah, okay, give my age away. Back in the 20th century, they didn't think that anyone should be starving in the 20th century. So you would have had social justice warriors and they were campaigning for things like that. But not only were they campaigning, a lot of the times you would have seen them living what it was they were preaching. Okay? They were modeling it, they were demonstrating it. What we have today, what they're calling social justice today, seems more like social vengeance, social injustice, really. And the best way to create justice is to create more injustice somewhere else. So it's a rewriting of terms, if you know what I mean.
It seems like a very zero sum mindset. Well, it's like, we're never going to have justice for this group unless we attack and take from this other group. There's no like idea of like a non-zero sum growing the pie. It's like, you have to target some group that you call privileged and, justice hinges on you hurting them in some way.
Yeah. Which is very common with narcissism, exaggerated victimhood. It's another way people get guilt tripped and shamed into going along with certain things. Nobody wants to hurt someone who's already hurt. You know what I mean? So that there can be something quite coercive there. But what this does, I think, is it does take away from genuine cases of discrimination. Because you can't say discrimination doesn't happen. It does. You can't say people aren't treated unfairly because of X, Y, and Z, because it does happen by certain individuals, certain groups. It does happen, and there are maybe social justice warriors out there who do genuinely believe what they're doing is the right thing. Unfortunately, they tend to get tied up and dumped in the same group or category as the other group that just want to burn everything down.
It almost reminds me of The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Where it's like, hey, there was this racist Nazi professor who was pushing white supremacy. Oh my gosh, we need to go help, and then you explore, all that happened is they assigned Shakespeare as reading in one of their classes. And, you hear these stories over and over and you kind of become jaded to it. Or it's like, I'm sorry, if you call racism, like I'm not going to come and help you because I've been duped too many times. It may be legitimate this time, but I've been fooled, and I feel like I'm not going to waste my time. And I feel like when, like you said, when there are legitimate instances of racism, sexism, homophobia, what have you, too many people have just said, I assume that, you saw a man catching a fish or something. I mean, just something completely innocuous that most people wouldn't care about. And it's just this world ending event to you. And so we're just going to stop taking you seriously.
It's back to what we were talking earlier. There's the histrionics. And there's the emotional dysregulation. You're right. It's what's the slur of the month, isn't it? Isn't it Nazi or something? That one usually comes back every couple of years.
Yeah.
But it's trendy at the moment. If everybody's a Nazi, what does it even mean anymore? That being said, With cluster B, particularly with the narcissistic personality, there is something very manipulative. People do not like to be called certain names, certain terms. It might go against their very core, it might be really insulting. There could also be consequences with a slur like that. So nobody wants to get called a bigot, a Nazi, a fascist. Something, anything with ist or phobic at the end of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody wants to be labeled as that. So there is something quite powerful in using and rewriting and using language out of context like that.
You hit on histrionic and narcissistic quite a bit. I'm wondering if you see borderline, because I see like people who might be in more influential positions as more narcissist, more consciously being manipulative. And I see a lot of kind of lower level social justice people is more borderline, where it's like they're not consciously manipulating, they're just driven by extreme emotion dysregulation. I've had people that I've worked with at mental health centers where one person said because we did not offer Coca-Cola at the facility, it was a violation of our constitutional rights. There was another one who thought that, it was like a life and death issue, that the movie we were watching at the facility was not the one that she wanted. So a lot of times with BPD, you see this life and death level 10 emergency. And I see the same thing with social justice. Shakespeare was assigned in one of my classes. If we don't protest this, the Nazis are going to win. It's like that level of like emotion dysregulation for what to most people would seem like really minor or insignificant issues.
Yeah. Things become magnified with borderline. What's not uncommon is because of the dysregulation. A borderline person will know they're feeling bad, they're hurt. They might not necessarily understand why or be able to articulate, but they just know it's painful. And if you were in a relationship with someone with a borderline personality, what you'll happen is it all comes out. It all comes out. And you're not quite sure what the actual issue is because it comes out as this kind of like emotional vomit. There's a lot of stuff going on. Internally, the borderline person, I don't want to speak for all of them, I'm being very general. When they're feeling pain and they're taking that pain out on someone, that person has just become every single person who has ever hurt them, abused them, wounded them, rejected them, humiliated them. Not being able to fully, again, understand or regulate, it all comes out at once. And that's why you can get, everything seems to be exaggerated, if you know what I mean. It feels as if it's being exaggerated. And the person on the other end of it doesn't really know what's going on. You're wondering, but this is only Shakespeare, or this was, we're watching Ghostbusters instead of Star Wars, what's the big deal? We don't get it because we don't know what's going on. But again, when you find a group and you get a lot of like-minded people, what you find is because one person's outraged, then another person becomes outraged, and they all become outraged for each other and with each other. They all try to help each other. They all think they're all doing the same thing. So they're really all validating each other. They're validating each other's pain, each other's misery, each other's upset. But no one's actually working with them to try to pick apart what is it's really going on. The idea of the movie or Shakespeare, to be able to just say, I'm disappointed, I wanted to read something else, or I wanted to watch something else. It feels more like there's been something terrible done to them.
Ah, that's such a good point that you make there, because they're definitely, you mentioned earlier, like bad actors who are being manipulative, that narcissist personality. But there's a lot of these more borderline type personalities that I see in the social justice movement where, you say something like, uh, I don't think Brexit was particularly bad for the UK. You just say something like that. And in my body, I'm feeling something. Like something is not right in my body when I hear you say that. I don't feel safe. I feel like I'm physically in danger. I might be at risk of being physically assaulted. And I have this reaction. Right. And when you get like either these protests or a lot of these college campuses, it's like contagious cluster B, where that type of mentality, I don't feel safe. It's contagious and it spreads.
Yeah. Let's go a wee bit upstream from that, okay?
Yeah.
Safety. I hear that term a lot about feeling safe, and people talk about a safe space, things like that. Personally, I've got nothing against it. I don't think it's a bad idea. However, here's the caveat. What we need to do is we need to define what the actual danger is. What is the actual threat? What's the actual risk? Now, when I say there's nothing necessarily wrong with a safe space, I'll give you a context to that. I grew up in a country where for a generation we were planting bombs in shadows and shooting at each other because we didn't like our surnames, things like that. We didn't like what school the other person went to. Coming out of that, going into the peace process, there are still a lot of people who were hurt, maimed, widowed, whatever, lost parents, lost brothers, sisters. A lot of people struggling with the aftermath of a generation's worth of terrorism. What you can't do is you cannot dismiss their pain. You can't tell them to get over it. We're all friends now. That's not how it works. So I have been, colleagues like myself, we have been at these events where people are talking about how to best support victims, survivors, things like that, looking for some kind of justice, some kind of answer. And at something like that, there would be a safe space. And all that is really is just a quiet little room where when people are talking about things that bring up stuff that really do trigger the traumatic situations and events that they've been through, it can be very, very distressing. You have to watch someone you love maybe being shot in front of you. Of course, that's going to have an impact on you. So that kind of safe space, I'm all in favor for. And all it is somewhere where someone can, if you will, someone like me might be there just to help someone de-escalate what's going on with them. Do we need a safe space because the local cinema is playing Jaws? Do we need a safe space because someone votes for a different party than you? So it's trying to define what we actually mean by safe and a safe space. So this is what I meant by going upstream from that. Not everybody, not all narcissists, put it this way, not all narcissists know they're narcissists. Now, they might not necessarily have a personality disorder, a diagnosable disorder. They just might be very high in traits, very deeply ingrained traits. If you were to say to them, "Hey, you're being a bit narcissistic," they take great umbrage to that. How dare you? I'm a wonderful person. I'm lovely. I'm so empathic. I feed the penguins at the zoo. I'm absolutely brilliant. What you have are people who may genuinely believe they are good. Good people do good things. So they're looking for good things to do. And they're trying to protect people, but what they don't recognize is the difference between a good thing and the right thing. So they're trying to wrap people in cotton wool, make their lives easier. Really what they're doing is feeding their own ego, and they're not helping anybody. There's a difference between, a book or a film that maybe has a content warning, this contains scenes of violence or this contains scenes of an adult nature or something like that. There's a difference between that, and it's one that Andrew Doyle mentioned earlier, one that he pointed out. The Old Man in the Sea. This book contains graphic scenes of fishing. Treating people like they are infants, infantilizing them, if you will. They get a sense of power, they get a sense of accomplishment, they get a sense of validation by doing all this kind of thing. And so they impose all of this stuff. You have to be respectful, but they don't know what respect means. They don't teach people what respect means. They think respect just means obedience and compliance. No, that's not respect. You have to be like this and you have to be like that, and you're not allowed to say the wrong thing. And if anybody points it out or if anyone challenges, they're the bad guy, they're the villain. So by the time that filters down, what do you expect is going to happen whenever someone sees they're playing the movie they didn't want to see? Of course, they're going to feel they're being attacked.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most interesting examples of this to me is if you know Christina Hoff Sommers. She went and spoke on a college campus. This has actually happened multiple times. And because she's a liberal feminist instead of a radical feminist, the students had meltdowns. They had to bring in therapy dogs to comfort the students because, she would say things like the gender pay gap is due to things other than discrimination. And they would just, they had never heard any ideas challenge their point of view before, and they're just having a meltdown.
Didn't fit the narrative.
Yes, yes. And I think part of it is these ideas are so tied to their identities that if you say, "Hey, I don't think all these ideas are factually accurate or don't stand up to logical analysis, what have you," it's like I'm like a part of me is dying in a sense.
Yeah. Again, going back to I mentioned him earlier, Ellison is irrational beliefs.
Yeah,
I am my beliefs.
yeah. That's a good point.
Identity is a curious thing. It's something I've never got my head around. It's something I don't fully understand. And again, I think it's something that's taken out of context and given a whole new meaning, because your identity is going to fluctuate and change in different situations and throughout your life. There's different aspects to it. It's multi-layered. There's so many levels to it. You're a son. You're a brother. You're a pal, a friend. You're you're a dad. You're a partner. You're a therapist. You're a cab driver. You're a hairdresser. Do you know what I mean? There's so many different things. There's so many different aspects to us, and they're not always going to be the same in every situation. Sometimes you're going to be the smartest person in the room. Sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're the caveman, you know.
Yeah.
And when people put so much weight and you know, so much importance on their identity, but not recognizing their identity is so multi-layered, so changeable, and it's going to change throughout your life. How you identify yourself is going to change in many different. Your core will remain the same. A lot of the time, it's going to remain the same, but those different aspects of us are going to change.
I want to discuss a little bit. It might be kind of like a chicken and an egg type problem, but with this type of emotion instability, dysregulation, cluster B type stuff, and social justice ideology, does this movement, do you think, draw in those type of people who are already less emotionally regulated? Or does the ideology kind of cause emotional dysregulation, or is it some kind of combination of the two?
An interesting question. If I can maybe take it back a little bit, where I said we're looking at more personality type than left or right. A good friend, I'm not sure if you're aware of him, Ed Dutton, the Jolly Heretic. Okay, he could answer this a lot better. He knows he's an evolutionary psychologist, so he knows a lot of the research on this. I think it's more a personality type, in the sense that they're a personality type that will gravitate towards what gives them power, status, and kudos. Whether that's left or right, by the way. Because you go back even a couple of centuries, you would have seen the Puritans of old burning witches and things like that. You know, they're so morally superior and they're closer to God than you'll ever be. And throughout the ages, you get that. In these different movements and things that have happened, it's personality types, and they tend to be gravitated towards what's going to give them power. Whether that's going to be a religious Puritan, whether it's going to be a political one, whether that's going to be a social justice thing, whether that's going to be whatever, financial even. When they get into positions of power, they tend to, through, as I mentioned earlier, problematizing things and so on, they do tend to attract other people. Those movements, those little groups, they attract other kind of people who think they are on the right side, which is why over the past few years we've been hearing so much about the right side of history. Because they believe again, they're good people. They think they're good people. They are doing a good thing. And they believe they are on the right side. And anyone who isn't is bad. They're wicked. They're the villains and so on. And there's no such thing as context, nuance, things like that. It's either this or it's that. It's not that there's a spectrum in between. It isn't. It's a dichotomy, you know. So they're going to attract people like that. And it's the people, those people on the ground. A lot of the time they're being told what they want to hear, told maybe what they need to hear. You are special, you are unique, and that group over there are trying to take something from you. They're bad, they're wicked, and they're evil. And people tend to have lost the ability. Again, I don't know if social media has either caused this or it's certainly exacerbated it. People have lost that ability to actually question. Not just question the other people and try to listen for a new piece of information, but question themselves. You know, you think of CBT. There is, which is often overlooked, there's a philosophical element to CBT, which could be summed up as, tell me what you believe and tell me why you believe it. Now, that's quite philosophical, you know, but people seem to have lost that. They talk about their beliefs as if they're facts because the people they're following or the people that are leading them or whatever it is, whatever ideology or cult or group or movement, whatever it is they're involved with, is telling them this is the narrative. And the thought of challenging that narrative, losing that narrative, well, they might be expelled, they might be treated like the enemy, they might lose their connection. And all of these things are terrifying for people. We all want to fit in somehow. We all want to belong somewhere.
Yeah, well, that's really good. If you had a client who came to you and said, you know, the right wing people are out to get me. There's racists and fascists and homophobes and Nazis kind of lurking around every corner. I fear for my life. I don't feel safe when I'm, walking around the streets kind of thing. How would you begin therapy with that person?
Well, this is the thing. Sometimes when people are, if you think of it, I wouldn't even say certain movements, most movements, I'd say, and when it comes to ideologies, a lot of them operate like cults. So they actually reprogram you. They lead you to believe that you're lacking something and only they can give you it. They'll keep you safe. They'll keep you special. They have all the answers and so on. When someone presents with something that's maybe been drummed into them and it's like a cult-like belief. If you were to do this from a cognitive behavioral therapy approach, you would be looking for what fuels the belief. You'd be looking at beliefs being either fact or feeling. There's no third one, by the way. If you can think of a third one, share it with me because I've racked my brains for over a decade and I can't find one. They're either fact or feeling. It's learning to discern the difference. Now, what you're not doing is you're not challenging your client and telling them they're wrong and here's a better way of seeing the world. But you're asking them to explore what is fueling the belief. And sometimes what you find there are things there might be things that were true at one point. Maybe they're not true anymore. There might have been things that were true in a certain situation, but not necessarily relevant to this one. Sometimes what you might find is these are things that we were led to believe. So it's really trying to pick that belief apart and to explore it. I like to say we explore it with intent, okay? Not telling the client they're wrong, but exploring alternatives. Because you think of, I think it was Alice that came up with the ABC model. The activating event. What do you believe just happened? What's the consequence of the belief? I think it's very useful to add a D for dispute. Is it really the way you're seeing it? Could there be reasonable alternatives? Does every single person in this group, are every single one of them the same? Do they all come at you like stormtroopers in Star Wars or something? Are they all like the Borg in Star Trek? Are they all identical? Because they can't be. Looking at, yes, there are people who would threaten you. There are people who probably wouldn't give you the time of day. There are people who think you're a waste of time. Not all of them. That might take quite a bit of work, but
Yeah. If you were talking to a therapist, a colleague who's a therapist, and they thought, I care, I have empathy for the marginalized, I want to make the world a better place, I want to stop suffering. And I think that as a therapist, the best way I can do that is to focus on politics. And, you know, people who don't share my politics are really not worth helping because that's really pushing us in the wrong direction. Like, how would you talk to a therapist who's conceptualized their profession in this way?
well, maybe I'd go into my clinical supervisor mode. I would remind them that it's the client's process, it's not yours. You're not there to turn your client into a version of you. You're there to help your client build on things like their self-efficacy, have a bit of faith in themselves, build their confidence, their resilience, things like that. You're not there to tell them what's wrong with them, fix them, cure them, or turn them into something. It's their process.
Fix the therapy profession.
You're asking me all the easy questions. How do we fix the therapy process, the therapy profession? To be honest, I don't know where to begin because, again, I have a friend who teaches at university, teaches therapy, counseling, and so on. And one of the things he said to me over dinner once was he knows when he's working with someone, you kind of get a sense if someone has the aptitude, someone has the personality type and so on. Someone's going to make a good therapist or someone isn't. You just get a gut feeling. That being said, sometimes you're wrong. Someone turns out to be wonderful. Um, but he says sometimes he's working with people and he knows that they're just not the right person for the job. But he can't stop them because they've paid their fees, they're doing their course and they're passing all their exams. So I don't know. Maybe it would come down to something like doing some kind of personality test, but then are we going to go into the realms of discriminating or something? It's a hard one. Therapy is like a lot of professions. There are different professions that do attract different personality types, like the police, medicine, nursing, doctors, therapists, things like that. Sometimes I think it gives them a sense of power. It gives them a sense of status, things like that. And going back to this thing about left and right, although we might see it more vocal on the left, doesn't mean there aren't right-wing people. And I don't mean right-wing as in just to vote conservative, but they would be the right-wing version of the social justice warrior, if you know what I mean. They're just the same. As I say, it gets to the point where you can't tell them apart. How do you filter them out? How do you stop them? I don't know. Maybe unless these things do start to become properly regulated. And there are rules. When I was training, when I was studying, and even to this day, this is why we have things like clinical supervision. You have to leave your own stuff at the door. I think maybe that's what's been forgotten. People aren't, they're bringing their own stuff into the room with them. They're setting their own agenda for what the therapy's going to be. Maybe that's what's going on.
What advice would you give to like a young counselor who's still in grad school?
Learn everything you can. Make as many mistakes as you can. Don't be afraid of the mistakes. You're not going to learn unless you make mistakes. If they are still teaching, I'm sure they are still teaching person-centered. Hold on to those core conditions. When you're working with someone, you're using your empathy. Now, you're not feeling what they're feeling. You're not sort of like clutching them and going, oh my goodness, I get it too. No, even if you don't get it, you're trying to imagine what that would feel like if it were you. You're understanding that they are struggling. So you're getting the sense of that. Use your empathy. Your client does not have to earn your positive regard. They do not have to be a version. They do not have to do or say something to earn your compassion, your common decency, things like that, your courtesy. You don't have to earn anything. And the last one is just be honest. Just be congruent. Be genuine. Be authentic. Even if they say something you find uncomfortable, it's being honest in that moment. Being able to say, I find that uncomfortable.
It almost feels like a lot of this is teaching people how to fake being authentic. Like I look at like BetterHelp and it's like, for X amount of money a month, you can get authenticity on demand. It seems like really like the opposite in my head.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Fake authenticity. If you can if you can feign being authentic, you've got it made. Yeah. And again, that would be a characteristic of narcissism. Narcissistic people are able to sound very sci-fi here. They're able to morph into whatever it is they think you need, whatever it is they think you want. They can feign the authenticity. They become something you think you can't do without. That's why a lot of the time we believe them, we follow them, and we think we are on the right side and so on. I'm going to say something there, but mine just went blank. To apologize.
It happens to me a lot. I understand. So I have one final question. When you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
I think we need to bring back humility. Let's make that fashionable again. Humility, again, I think it's one of those words that has been hijacked and turned into something else. We often see a lot of false humility, not fake humility. Someone pointing, it's this wonderful thing they've just done. I feel so humbled to have been able to do this wonderful thing, being inauthentic. Humility is not being in a low mood. It's not trailing your knuckles behind you on the floor and moaning that you're crap at everything. Humility is recognizing that you don't know everything. You can't do everything. There are people out there who are more accomplished than you, or maybe have more skills in certain areas and know things that you don't. That's humility, and it's not a bad thing. We've talked about narcissism a few times today. Narcissism and humility rarely go in the same sentence. In fact, if you could try and find them in the same sentence, that would be interesting. Humility. The other thing we need is confidence, not arrogance.
Interesting contrast there.
Yes, not arrogance, not a false confidence, just the ability to recognize your qualities and your skills and your achievements and things like that, but also being able to recognize there are things that you don't know, things that you can't do. Again, that's where the humility comes in, okay? The third thing is resilience, which I think I mentioned earlier, might have been just before we were recording. I don't know if I mentioned it while we were recording. Some therapists are online typing about how they hate the word resilience, and my immediate thought is, well, maybe you're in the wrong job. Resilience isn't just the ability to bounce back from things. It's the ability to be resourceful and to be able to navigate through and around problems. Okay, there's a lot much more to it than that. And the last thing, a little bit of courage. You can't have courage unless you're afraid. You need fear in the first place. Confidence, humility, resilience, and courage. I think when we have those things, You're your own safe space. And I think maybe we need to be talking a bit more about those things, developing and building those things instead of wrapping people in cotton.
Yeah, I love all those. I feel like that's, there's like an older wisdom that feels like we've lost where those things would have been a lot more valued than they are today.
But yeah, again, going back to how I've mentioned a few times, the irrational beliefs. Some people do maybe think they are doing good, but they think that they are responsible for other people. And that's where you see a lot of coddling. That's where you see a lot of wrapping people in cotton wool. That's where you see, I'm not recognizing that by doing that, you're taking away their efficacy. You're actually diminishing their confidence. Because the first time someone is met with some kind of hardship, they're just going to go into a collapse of some kind. They're going to panic.
I know I said that was the last question, but I have one thing, or maybe a couple things that are interesting me. I'm looking
Okay.
behind your shoulder and I see a TIE fighter.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
I am something of a sci-fi nerd. I grew up. I find this interesting. I was talking to another gentleman recently, and we were talking about the power of stories, the importance of narratives, and how we learn from stories. And something he said to me, I thought was, it just suddenly clicked with me. What we have today in things like science fiction is the same kind of thing that the ancient Greeks were getting from their myths and so on.
Ooh, wow.
We're getting, yeah, we're getting, because we're learning about human beings, human nature, and so on, but we're learning about it sort of detached from it, where there is things like, magic, Martians, and things like that, all that stuff that's going on. So I kind of grew up with sci-fi. I was about 7 the first time I saw Star Wars, and it always stuck with me. Before that, you can see over my shoulder a little Starship Enterprise.
Yeah.
That's the pride of my collection. The reason it is the pride of my collection, because Santa Claus brought that exact model to me when I was 8 years old. And I have commanded that little ship through many a mission over the years. So yeah, I grew up with science fiction and so on, and I like a lot of the stories and some of the things they're telling us, especially the older stuff, writers like Philip K. Dick and so on. But I also collect antique toys. So what you see over my shoulder are my sci-fi ones, what you don't see at the other end of the room are my little lorries and tanks and things.
I'm a big fan of Greek mythology and Star Wars, so I love that you made that connection.
Mm. It never dawned on me until he
Yeah.
mentioned.
Yeah. I see them as, I mean, it makes sense when you say it out loud, but I see them as like very like opposite things in a sense, but they really are very much similar in that they're drawing on these kind of archetypes that we've internalized and explaining normal parts of the human experience in like grandiose ways that you can understand when you think about it bigger.
Yeah. And you mentioned the archetypes. Yeah, we recognize and we learn, we identify archetypes. And you think of a story where there's a young guy and he grows up on the outskirts. He knows he's special, but he doesn't know how. There's just something different about him. And for some reason, he has to go on a quest. And along the way, he's going to meet this older guy who's a veteran of whatever it is, who's going to mentor him. He's going to meet a rogue who you never know whose side he's on, even though he always ends up doing the right thing. There's usually a princess of some kind who's going to either have to be rescued or is going to play a huge, significant part in it. And I've just described Star Wars, but I've also described Lord of the Rings. I've also described The Lion King, and I've also described Rocky.
Yeah. There was a quote in one of my social psychology books. I'm going to butcher it, but it's like every society in history that we've ever studied has heroic young men who seek advice from wise older men to win the affection of young princesses to the applause of the rest of the people. It's like that kind of archetype is
Yeah.
universal.
Yeah. It's fun. I can't remember who it was as well, but somebody said that there's only something like 9 stories. They're just all
Yeah.
told differently. Yeah.
And over your other shoulder is that an award, a YouTube award?
Because I'm usually sitting in front of it, I always forget about it. Yeah. This is my ego starting to flex now. Yeah, I got that. I think it was almost a year ago now. That was for reaching 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. So yeah, I kind of feel good about that. Yeah.
Congrats on that. So
Thank you very
subscribe
much.
to Darren's YouTube channel.
Yeah, please do watch me. I'm very interesting.
Yes. Well, Darren, it's been a fascinating, phenomenal conversation. I've loved having you, loved talking to you, and thank you so much for coming on and joining me.
Thanks for having me on. It was a great chat, and maybe we could do this again sometime.
I'd love to.